morning paper and an afternoon paper. It's a big town, and they're big papers. The morning paper is the Globe Democrat. And the afternoon paper is the Post-Dispatch, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. I've watched the presses through those windows and stopped at that driveway for years. I've turned the corner and walked past the main entrance. But one day, I didn't walk past. Hi, I'm the finder. When I went in that front door, I met Mr. Raymond L. Crowley, the managing editor of the Post-Dispatch. So I told him, what I want to find out about this building is what goes on in here. Exactly what goes on in here. And he kind of laughed. That if you want to find out what goes on here, you better get up at 6 in the morning. 6 a.m. when the city editor comes to work. Well, I want to find out answers to why afternoon newspaper has to get started at 6 a.m. and why the city editor has to be there that early. I guess the only way I could find out answers to those questions was to be there that early, so I went to bed in my clothes to make sure I wouldn't be late. Come on, get up. So when you hear this little song, you'll learn what's on my mind. Headlines, deadlines, roll that press. And that's the nice big fine, and that's the nice big fine. Well, even though I slept in my clothes, I didn't quite make it. I was a few minutes late, but I was ready to go to work. The managing editor hadn't been fooling me. There were some fellows working already. It turned out that they were chief at the copy desk, assistant picture editor, the early news editor and wire editors. But there weren't any reporters there, just row on row of empty desks. And up front, like a teacher getting ready for his class to arrive, was Ev Graham, the city editor. Since I was the first reporter on the job, I walked right up and said, "What's hot today, Chief?" Sent to the bench before I'd had a chance to get going. Of course, I'd been kidding. But when I opened the paper, I thought Graham was kidding me. It was the latest edition of the rival paper. But it wasn't a joke. Graham was reading it too, because the city editor has a half an hour to catch up with the news before the first reporters come in to receive their assignments. And one of the best ways to do this is to check a morning paper. He marks the items that he wants to check up on, such things as, how's that test pilot who cracked up last night? Then the chief clerk clips out the items that he's checked. Whenever anyone on a newspaper hears of something that's going to happen tomorrow or 6 months from now, he puts a little reminder in the future book under the appropriate date. The city editor has 100 eyes and ears. And piling up on his desk overnight are reports from the nightman, the police reporter, the assistant city editor, and the picture editor. And he has to decide what's news. News from in and around the city. At the same time, at the wire desk, the telegraph editor is deciding what's news from around the nation. And the cable editor is sifting news from overseas. News from the Associated Press, the United Press, and the Washington Bureau of the Post-Dispatch. There are decisions to be made about pictures, too. City news, national news, international news, pictures. Everything has to be ready to go to press by about 10:15. Deadline for the first edition. Approximately 50 pages, thousands of words, and 3 hours and 45 minutes to do it in. The first reporters are on the job now, and it's time to get started. As the city editor assigns each story, he makes a note on his pad. Lilienthal, top 2, thief. Lilienthal is the reporter, top 2 is the size and style of headline, and thief is the slug. Slug is newspaper talk for a short code name which will identify the story until it's in print. Reporters come to work in relays, and over at the copy desk, they're already turning slugs into headlines. Headline writing is easy. You have this whole chart memorized. And if you know every size and style of type that's on it. And if you can figure out how to say, last night at 10 p.m., 3,000 hippopotami were swept over Victoria Falls in 3 words. That's not all they do at the copy desk. Every story gets a final check for grammar and spelling. How do you spell hippopotami? This is the last chance to check it before it's sent to the composing room to be set and typed.
Copy. Copy.
The picture editor's first job of the day is to select and arrange the photographs for the day's picture page. He calls this doing the layout. I was beginning to realize that every man had his own job to do, and in most cases a special time to do it. Like every other morning, the call comes in from the reporter at police headquarters with a rundown on crimes, accidents, and fires. And like every other morning, the assistant city editor starts out his day in a conference with his boss. Brief jobs is a time to start and a time to finish. And these men know from experience what time that is. Even the copy boy knows when it's time for coffee. At 8:15, Art Bertelson, the early news editor, starts to pull the paper together. First stop, city editor, local news. What do you got for the front page, Ev? Well, I got a pretty good fire going on the east side. Worth a picture? Maybe. Harry's over there. I'm waiting for a call. Okay, let me know. Stop number 2, cable editor, world news. Stop number 3, wire editor, national news. Anything from the White House? Dummy. That's what newspaper men call the rough sketch, which shows where the different stories will be located in the printed paper. Without this dummy, the men setting the type wouldn't know where to put anything. All the decisions which have been made up till now are temporary, because Raymond L. Crowley, who is the man responsible for every line of news in the paper, he's the managing editor. On one side of his office is the city editor with his two assistants, and on the other side are the news editors. 1 hour before press time every morning, Mr. Crowley walks out of his office for a conference with the news editors. Everything these men know about today's news is presented. The dummy and all the decisions made since 6 o'clock this morning are reviewed. What comes out of this conference will be today's first edition. And if all the facts aren't in yet, there are only 45 minutes left to get them.
Copy, boy.
Thanks a lot.
"10 o'clock. In 15 minutes, the first edition will be closed. The managing editor himself couldn't add another line. Unless, of course, the White House suddenly caught on fire.
Copy. 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 Copy.
"10:15, and the first edition is closed, so everybody relaxes. The managing editor has a little time to chat with the society editor. He's in charge of all the news, and weddings are news too. The city editor is going to lunch. And the assistant city editor passes out the aspirin. Well, by that time, I felt like I needed a couple of aspirin tablets myself. And so I wasn't quite so busy, and Jim Puster, one of the copy boys, was sitting over on the copy bench, and I thought I'd go over and talk to him and see if I couldn't get some first-hand information. Jim? I've been around a lot now looking at what goes on around here, and I thought maybe you could tell me something about what the copy boy's job is and what you expect to go to after a copy boy. Does a copy boy ever aim to become a reporter? Is that the deal?
Not too much. You can't work up to it. Few have, but I mean, it's not generally. Well, you could do that, but copy boys generally don't.
Yeah. You know, I've been wanting to ask a question about copy boys. I see everybody running around so much and called a copy, you know. And I was wondering if maybe when the things really get going good, does that ever kind of get on your nerves?
After about the third day, you just get used to it. I mean, the first couple of days, you're just going crazy, but after that, it doesn't faze you.
Yeah, well, suppose some real big thing happened. Are you allowed to read the news? That is, do you ever pick up on this news as you carry it around?
We're not supposed to, but I do every once in a while.
Save it until you get home, read it at night, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. About how many fellas are there work normally as copy boys here?
Oh, let's see, offhand, there's about 8.
8 guys, huh?
I mean, with 8, you don't have any trouble. With less than that, it's a little bit cramped.
Mm-hmm. You get, like, I noticed that the fellas didn't always stay right in this department. You know, they'd run out. You get sent on errands into other departments. Do you get to know anything about the makeup of the paper other than right here?
You have to go back to makeup, 10 or 11 times a day. over there on the copy table, they put it under that box, and when they holler makeup, you gotta take it back.
Yeah.
So you can pretty well find out what goes on back there.
Well, whatever got you started on this job, Jim?
Well, I answered an ad in the paper, and I come down here on the Saturday, and Monday I started work.
You like it?
It's all right. I haven't anything against it.
Any of the other members of your family or anything like that, have you got a heritage of working for newspaper or anything like that?
Well, my dad runs the paper now, and I've worked on him since I was about 9 years old, so it's not too new to me.
Where's this paper?
It's down in Georgia.
Not as big as this one, I guess, huh?
Well, not quite.
Well, I don't know. Maybe that's, maybe instinctively you've got printer's ink in you, see, and that's why you're here.
Maybe so.
What's the most interesting part of this job?
Oh, that's hard to say. To me, it's all interesting, but,
Seems to me like that business is getting shouted at on a busy time and would really get you.
Oh, excuse me, sir.
Oh, okay. Well, back to work. When I looked up, there was a new face in the managing editor's office. It turned out to be George Londa, the makeup editor who had come in from the composing room with the overset from the first edition. The overset is the copy which was set in type, but didn't get into the first edition. Copy that was either too late or for which there wasn't room. Mr. Crowley is deciding whether there's anything worth making room for in the second edition. The first edition is off the press, and Mr. Crowley and the news editors are waiting to tear it apart and put it back together again. X means kill it, and O means use it if you have room for it. The assistant city editor brings in the latest local news. The assistant cable editor has a hot item from Rome. Everybody watches the boss, and when he makes an X, everyone makes an X, because the papers they're marking will serve as a guide to all departments through the second edition. And when the second edition comes out, it will serve as a guide to the third edition. The third edition is a guide to the fourth edition, and the fourth edition to the fifth and last. But this is the second edition, and the changes are already on their way to the composing room. The chief of the composing room copy desk receives the copy and stamps it with time received. It's now ready to be picked up by the linotype operators, who will set it in metal type. There are about 40 linotype machines at the Post Dispatch, and they're not all operated by men. Margaret Beeman is one of the best. These complicated machines have a keyboard, something like a typewriter. But instead of printing directly on paper through a carbon ribbon, they cast single lines of metal type, the exact width of a newspaper column. Several machines may be working on one story, but all the type isn't set on machines. Headlines are set by hand. There are dozens of sizes, styles, and faces of type used daily by the Post Dispatch. After the compositor has set his type in metal lines, he takes it to the dump. The dump is newspaper lingo for the place where the lines of type are assembled into a story. From here, the news moves to the proofing press to be inked and printed on colored strips of paper. These strips are sent to the proofreading department, where they're given a final check for typographical errors. The type is then cleaned and taken to the page makeup men, who assemble the stories into pages. Herman Neiman, the page one man, will make some necessary changes for the second edition. All he's waiting for is the corrected page from the makeup editor and the makeup foreman. With this as a guide, he places the type into a metal frame called a chase. and locks it securely with the rest of the page by a system of wedges. Page 1, second edition, ready for molding. Then some finishing touches. And away it rolls to the stereotyping department. The type is pressed deeply into a sheet of heavy, moist paper, which leaves an exact impression of pictures and words. When this piece of paper is dried and curved, what you have is a mold of the whole page. The paper mold is placed in a stereotype casting machine, where it's poured full of hot type metal. And the curved plate that comes out is an exact copy of the flat page of type which the compositor assembled. The plate is inspected, marked with its page number, water-cooled, and down it goes to the press room on its own little elevator and system of tracks. There are 6 huge presses, each one capable of producing 70,000 papers an hour. Now you can see why the plates are curved. They have to fit on these cylinders. And it's time for the presses to roll. And down below each press, the rolls of paper begin to turn. The ink begins to flow. Printing 31,000 papers an hour makes an awful lot of noise. There's the paper. A lot of pictures, a lot of type, a lot of labor, and a lot of decisions have been made about what's news. Well, we have a man here who is very responsible for the decisions about what's news, the city editor, Mr. Everett Graham. Ev, what is news? What makes news?
That's about the hardest question you could have asked me, Steve. We all know what it is, and we deal with it all the time. We're constantly deciding what is and what isn't news, but there is no really objective definition you can give of what is news. About the best I can say, I guess, is that it's something that is of general interest or of general importance or both. Mm-hmm. And it's not something which is of interest only to one person. I mean by that something that is news is something that you care about as a reader, but it has to be more than that. For example, if you were to get home late, say, after work someday, and forget to tell your wife in advance, well, you would hear about it when you got home, and that would be the most important thing in your day, probably. But it wouldn't be of any interest to anybody else. So that it has to be something of general interest.
Things that happen, whether it's some kind of an animal falling down a manhole or some kind of a wreck, things that are of general interest, huh?
That's right. The obvious things are news, the big murders or a new budget over at City Hall or cabinet crisis in France or something of that sort, but there are lots of other things that are news, too. A cat getting stuck up in a tree, maybe, or a little story with the police like to be called cops, that kind of thing.
You say they do like or don't like?
They do around here.
Do they, really?
I couldn't speak for other cities, but they do in St. Louis.
Well, tell me something. Now, city editor, from what I've observed, has a big part in making the paper. And do you consider it as a hard job, Ev?
City editor?
Yeah.
It's an extremely hard job. It's very nerve-wracking, and you're constantly keyed up, constantly having to think of things, doing things. You never have a minute to relax.
Well, I've noticed around here that there doesn't seem to be a lot of confusion. I mean, I've always thought of a newspaper office, you know, as people running in, running out. What's the reason for that?
Sometimes there is a lot of confusion, unfortunately. But in general, everybody, by sort of tacit agreement, does things as quietly as we possibly can, with as little confusion as possible, so that we won't get into each other's hair, and so that we'll be able to keep the work flowing as smoothly as possible. If we didn't do that, we'd all die of ulcers.
Well, you say that there sometimes is confusion.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here's an example. Now, suppose, you know, just before the paper was ready to go to bed, that is, just before it's being printed, or maybe it's on the presses already for the first edition, suppose you heard that the mayor had been kidnapped. What would you do? Would you send somebody out there and stop the presses?
First thing I'd do would be to tell the managing editor, I think, that the mayor had been kidnapped, and then as soon as we had enough information to make about that much type, why, we'd send that out to the composing room and do what is called a replate. Replate, which means that you take something out of this paper to make room for this little bit of type and just throw it in. Then the presses are stopped long enough for a new plate with this thing inserted to be put on. And then they keep on going all the time.
Page 1 news, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, in other words, they'd get that page 1 back that we saw in type, and the makeup man would unlock it, put in your new little piece, take something out, put in the new little piece, and get a new mat made, put the lead in it again, and send that down, huh?
That's right.
And just stop the presses long enough to throw that plate on?
Throw that new plate on.
I see.
And if it were a story as important as the kidnapping of the mayor, for example, we'd be doing that for the next 3 hours.
I see. Now, every bit of news you got in, you'd keep doing that, huh?
Sure, because every time we did that, we'd catch another 15 or 20,000 papers with this extra little material ever we could find out about it in a hurry.
Well, you said that some days are slower days than others, and what do you do on a day that's really slow? Like, for instance, suppose this morning you hadn't got any news in much. What would you do about the front page?
Well, what you do for one thing on an occasion like that is rely on your brain. That's what we say. In some ways you work harder on those days than you do on days when there's a lot going on, because it means that you've got to sit down and think about, well, now, what happened yesterday or the day before that we didn't really tell about adequately that day? Because you can go back and resurrect, if you like, something that's happened previously and add some more information about it you left out the first time.
Fill in background.
Fill in background, or put together things which the reader ought to know about but just haven't had time to do before, or nobody's been able to write about, that kind of thing.
Well, you know, I've always thought that around a newspaper place like this, I've seen the paper made, and I've seen how it's put together and everything, but I expected I'd see newsmen running in and running out, and I didn't see any of that around here today.
Well, there are plenty of days when we have a lot of that, too, but as it happens, today was a kind of a quiet one. However, I've got a man who's going out to the zoo for a feature story. Would you like to go along with him?
Yeah, I'd very much like to go if it wouldn't be in his way.
No, I'd be glad to have you. Bill. Oh, Bill Wyant.
Well, we've seen the paper made. We've seen the news get set and typed, seen it plated and put on the press. Now I've got a chance to go out with a newspaper reporter, go to the zoo. And I'm going to be a kind of a reporter, too. And I'm going to report back to you on that. And I'm going to see if I can't get to go with some other reporters. And if I do, I know what it'll mean. It'll mean that I have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning again. So next time, you can expect to hear from me about how it is to be a reporter at the zoo. And when you hear this little song, you'll learn what's on my mind. How reporters get the facts. And that's the next big find, and that's the next big find.